In 1897, a farmer in a small Ohio town began selling apple butter from the back of a horse-drawn wagon. By 1980, that same family's company controlled more than 25% of every jar of jam and jelly sold across the entire United States. Walk into any American grocery store in the 1970s and find it immediately. The checkered gingham label, the little strawberry dancing in red and green, the squat glass jar sitting on the shelf like a quiet king. You didn't need to search. It was simply there. It had always been there. The J.M. Smucker Company was not just a food business. It was woven into the fabric of American childhood, into school lunchboxes, into Sunday morning kitchens, into the cultural shorthand of what it meant to eat something wholesome, something honest, something made with care. At its peak, yet the company employed thousands across manufacturing plants stretching from Ohio to California to Tennessee, with products distributed in more than 45 countries worldwide. Then something began to shift, not all at once, not with a single catastrophic crash, but slowly, silently, with the creeping certainty of a season changing. Today, while the famous Smucker's Jam, the product that built the empire, barely registers as a meaningful revenue driver inside the company that still bears the founder's name. A business that once announced itself with fruit preserves now generates the bulk of its income from coffee, pet food, and frozen sandwiches. The jam? Almost insignificant. So how does a company that defined an entire food category for nearly a century drift so far from its own identity? How does the king of jelly become the owner of Twinkies? This is the story of three things: a family that built something extraordinary from Ohio soil, a market that moved without warning, and a company that had to choose between legacy and survival. Welcome inside the Smucker's factory, where the sweetest empire in America learned the bitterest lesson of them all. 1897, Orrville, Ohio. The town barely registers on a map, 45 minutes south of Cleveland. It tucked into Wayne County, a quiet agricultural stretch of northeastern Ohio where the farmland runs flat in every direction and apple orchards grow thick along the roadsides. This is where Jerome Monroe Smucker was born. This is where he decided to bet everything. The family name itself carries a history. Jerome's ancestors had sailed from Switzerland in 1752 under the name Smucker. His grandfather David shortened it to Smoker, and Jerome, a Mennonite with strict conservative values and an instinct for honesty that bordered on the absolute, changed it one final time to Smucker, because he felt it better suited his principles. A man who would spend his life putting his name on jars of food thought carefully about what that name should be. By the time Jerome opened his cider mill in Orrville in 1897, he had already managed 4 farms and a creamery that shipped butter as far as New York City. And he was not a dreamer stumbling into business. He was methodical, educated through a 2-year business course at a local academy, experienced in the discipline of moving perishable goods across long distances at a time when refrigeration barely existed and railroads were the arteries of commerce. The apples that fed his mill came from orchards said to have been originally planted by Johnny Appleseed himself in the early 19th century. Whether entirely true or not, yes, it became part of the Smucker mythology. The idea that their roots ran all the way to the American frontier, but cider had a problem. It was seasonal. Revenue dried up in the months when apples were scarce. So Jerome turned to his Pennsylvania Dutch grandfather's recipe for apple butter. A slow-cooked, deeply flavored spread that could be preserved and sold year-round. Yet he developed a steam-powered process using copper coils in wooden vats that dramatically reduced cooking time while locking in flavor. Then he hand-signed the paper lid on every single stone crock he sold. Not a stamp, not a printed seal. His personal signature guaranteeing quality with his name. By 1915, the first year for which reliable records exist, The Smucker enterprise was generating nearly $60,000 in annual sales, $3,000 in net profit. Modest by any corporate measure, but in a small Ohio town at the beginning of the 20th century, it was the foundation of something enduring. The question now was whether the next generation would be bold enough to build on it. 1921, Orrville, Ohio, Jerome Monroe. Smucker incorporated his business in 1921, making it official, a private company wholly owned by him and his children. Annual sales at incorporation had reached $147,000. His wife Ella served as vice president on the board of directors. His eldest son Willard had been working in the operation since the age of 6. This was, from its very beginning, a family enterprise in the deepest possible sense. The years immediately following incorporation brought rapid expansion along the eastern seaboard. By 1923, Smuckers had added fruit jellies, jams, and preserves to the product line, a decision that would prove to be the single most important pivot in the company's first century. Apple butter was a niche product. Jams and jellies were a national category. The move opened up a market exponentially larger than anything Jerome had previously contemplated. By 1928, Willard Smucker had arranged something remarkable for a company of their size. The Pennsylvania Railroad built a dedicated siding, a private rail connection, directly into the Smucker plant in Orrville. Goods could now move by rail from the factory without the delays and costs of loading at a public terminal. Regional distribution stretched across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. The railroad siding was not merely convenient. It was transformational. Sales had climbed to $319,030. Sales had climbed to $319,000 by 1931. But 1932 and 1933 brought 2 consecutive years of losses, the only red ink the company would see for decades. Jerome Smucker began delegating authority to Willard, who in 1935 directed the establishment of the company's first facility outside Ohio, a pre-processing plant in the state of Washington, chosen for its high-quality, low-cost apples. Fruit was processed there, then shipped to Orrville for final cooking and packaging. Willard made another critical decision in 1938. The traditional stone crockery that Smuckers had used since Jerome's first wagon days was too heavy and too fragile for mass shipping. The family wanted to modernize packaging without losing the old-fashioned image of quality they had spent 40 years building. In 1939, they introduced the signature glass jar. Annual sales crossed $1 million. It was for the first time that same year. The jar, the railroad, and the jam. 3 things that would carry Smuckers into the modern era. 1942, Orrville, Ohio. Jerome Monroe Smucker was 83 years old when his company shipped its first products to Los Angeles, California. Its first true national distribution. He would live just long enough to see his business turn 50. He passed away in 1948 at the age of 90, having built from nothing a company that now served customers from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific. His sisters wrote at the time that he had been given far more than the average man's allotment of years and had used every one of them to build something that would outlast him. The second-generation handoff came in the late 1950s, when Willard's younger brother Paul Smucker joined him in charting a course for the company's next phase. Paul had started working in the factory at age 13, janitorial work, kitchen assistance, whatever was needed. He earned a business degree from Miami University in Ohio in 1939. He then returned to Orrville as a cost accountant at a salary of $100 per month. He was not a man inclined to shortcuts. In 1959, the J.M. Smucker Company went public. The initial offering raised $2.3 million. Not a massive sum, but enough to finance a serious expansion. The following year, Paul Smucker became president, and the company opened a major new manufacturing facility in Salinas, California, increasing production capacity by 40% in a single move. In 1963, Smucker's acquired Mary Ellen, a West Coast jam and jelly company with $4 million in annual sales. The acquisition extended geographic reach and eliminated a regional competitor simultaneously. In 1964, Kellogg's selected Smucker's Jam as the filling for its new Pop-Tarts product, a partnership that put the Smucker brand inside tens of millions of American homes in a way that no advertising campaign could have achieved on its own. In 1965, the company began manufacturing peanut butter for the first time. Ice cream toppings introduced in 1940 now accounted for 20% of all revenues. Then came something that would define the company for generations. Something that arrived not from a factory or a product line, but from the mind of a woman named Lois Wise, sitting in a Cleveland advertising office thinking about the strangest brand name she had ever encountered. What she came up with would become one of the most famous slogans in the history of American commerce. 1962, Cleveland, Ohio. Lois Wise was 36 years old when she cracked it. Born in Cleveland to immigrant parents, so she had co-founded Wise Advertising with her husband Mark in 1951, launching the agency from a small shared office in the Carnegie Hall building on Huron Road. By the time Smucker's came to them as a client in 1961, the agency was growing quickly. But Lois Wise herself was not yet known beyond the professional advertising circles of the Midwest. The Smucker's account presented an unusual challenge. The product was excellent. That much was clear. The family's commitment to quality was genuine and documented. But the name was a problem. Or was it? Wise turned the question over and sat with it. She understood something fundamental about American consumer psychology. Self-deprecating honesty creates trust faster than polished promises. A company willing to acknowledge that its own name sounds unusual must, by extension, be a company that values truth over image. She wrote 7 words. With a name like Smucker's, it has to be good. The Smucker family was initially reluctant. Nobody wanted to make fun of their own name. The name Jerome Monroe had so carefully chosen decades earlier. The name hand-signed on 10,000 crocks of apple butter. But Wise's instinct was right. The campaign launched on the West Coast, and the response was immediate. Sales doubled from $14.6 million in 1961 to $30 million in fiscal 1965. The company's stock was split 3-for-1 and listed on the New York Stock Exchange. The voice behind the radio advertisements was actor Mason Adams, who would continue as the brand's vocal identity for more than 30 years. His warm, authoritative delivery turned Smucker's into something that felt less like a corporation and more like a trusted neighbor. Yet when Adams passed away in 2005, television personality Willard Scott took over the role. But here's the thing about the campaign. It wasn't just successful. It was irreplaceable. No competitor could copy a slogan built so entirely around a unique family name. No generic brand could ever claim what Smucker's claimed. The oddness of the name had become its greatest commercial asset. The weakness had become the fortress wall. By 1980, Smucker's held over 25% of the entire American jam and jelly market. Number 1, undisputed. The empire was complete. But the forces that would eventually erode that empire were already forming. Slowly, quietly, in the aisles of supermarkets where store-brand jams were getting better every year. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. We are just getting to the part where everything starts to change. And trust me, it gets complicated. 1980, Orrville, Ohio. Walk through the Smucker's plant on Strawberry Lane in the early 1980s, and you would be greeted, before anything else, by a smell. Black raspberry most days, or grape, or strawberry. An almost overwhelming sweetness rising from what plant workers called the lagoons, vast open vats of fruit in various stages of reduction, yet the air above them thick with flavor. Tim Smucker, who would become president in 1981, once apologized to visitors for making them remove their watches and rings before entering. Hair nets were mandatory. The jam didn't need any additional ingredients. The company at this point was a precision machine. Timothy Smucker, the third generation's rising leader, had been appointed vice president of planning in the 1970s, was bringing a more systematic approach to operations and strategy. He and his brother Richard, who would join him at the executive level, had grown up inside this company. They had no illusions about what it was or what it required. In 1979, the company acquired Dickinson's, a gourmet preserves line that allowed Smuckers to compete in the premium segment without cannibalizing their mainstream offerings. In 1982, they purchased Magic Shell, the chocolate ice cream topping that hardens on contact with cold surface, and promptly reformulated the recipe to include real chocolate. In 1984, Timothy Smucker was named chairman. Richard Smucker assumed the presidency, and the family still retained 30% of all company stock. Over the course of the 1970s, sales had increased nearly 3 times over, reaching $145.8 million by decade's end. Profits had nearly doubled. The combination of expanded advertising, deeper penetration into southern markets, and strategic acquisitions had catapulted Smuckers to a market position that seemed almost unassailable. If Fortune magazine's annual list of the 100 best companies to work for in America would eventually name Smuckers number 1 in 2004. The peak of a 7-year consecutive appearance on that list beginning in 1998. The company's Orrville headquarters remained on Strawberry Lane, right where Jerome Monroe Smucker had built his original mill. A house he constructed in 1907 still stood on the campus. The physical continuity was deliberate. That the company wanted you to feel that it had never moved, never drifted, never changed its essential nature. But a critical problem was building just below the surface, and the family could feel it even if the public could not yet see it. 1984. Orrville, Ohio. Paul Smucker, then chairman, had a phrase he used when visitors asked about competition. He called their refusal to make private label jams and jellies a matter of principle, almost sacred. And heresy, he would exclaim to journalists who raised the subject. Smucker's had built its entire commercial identity on the premise that the brand name meant something. That customers would pay a premium for Smucker's because Smucker's was worth the premium. The idea of producing cheaper, unbranded versions of their own products for grocery store labels was philosophically unacceptable. The problem was that private label jams were getting better, much better. Supermarket chains with sophisticated food procurement operations were not offering consumers watery, inferior imitations. They were producing quality products at prices 10 to 20% lower than Smucker's. And American consumers in the 1980s were becoming more sophisticated, more price-conscious, and less automatically loyal to brand names they had grown up with. Meanwhile, Smucker's found itself facing failure in categories it had tried to enter. The pickle business, begun with the acquisitions of Worcester Preserving Company and H.W. Madison Company in the 1960s, was sold off in 1983. The chairman described pickles as fiercely price competitive, a category where consumers would not pay premium prices for a named brand. The lesson was important. Brand loyalty was not a universal principle. It was category-specific. In 1995, Smucker's bought Miss Smith's frozen pie business for $80 million. Less than a year later, they sold it at a loss to a subsidiary of Flowers Industries. Also in 1995, they divested their English subsidiary, Elsenham Quality Foods, taking a $6 million pre-tax loss. The international and premium diversification strategy was proving more difficult than the family had anticipated. Then, in 1994, when Smucker's ended their 35-year relationship with Wise Advertising, the firm that had created the most important slogan in the company's history, and moved their account to the Leo Burnett Company, a larger Chicago agency they believed could support more ambitious aspirations. It was a rational business decision, but it also marked the end of something intangible. The relationship that had produced those 7 famous words was over. By the mid-1990s, Smuckers held roughly 32% of the American jam market, still dominant, but the 4th generation of leadership, Timothy and Richard Smucker, were already asking a question that would define the next 2 decades. What exactly was this company supposed to be? 1997. Orrville, Ohio. The company turned 100 years old. An anniversary campaign featuring Tim and Richard Smucker growing up in Orrville in the 1950s generated national nostalgia and a measurable spike in sales. But nostalgia is not a business strategy, and the 4th generation leadership knew it. In the mid-1990s, Timothy and Richard Smucker had conducted an extensive internal strategy review, not just among executives, but reaching down to middle managers and factory workers throughout the company. What emerged was a clear-eyed assessment of where the real money in supermarkets actually lived. It wasn't in niche categories. It wasn't in regional specialty products. It was in the center of the store, in the mass-market branded products that Americans bought on autopilot, week after week, because the name on the label was one they trusted without thinking. Our strategy is to own and market #1 brands sold in the center of the store in North America, Richard Smucker stated flatly. And it was a complete reorientation. A company that had spent a century building from fruit outward was now asking what other categories it could dominate using the same playbook that had worked in preserves. In 1998, the company acquired Menu Saver, the maker of a product called the Incredible Uncrustables, a sealed, crustless, frozen peanut butter and jelly sandwich that had been invented as a convenience product for parents packing school lunches. Smuckers renamed it simply Uncrustables. The product generated $12 million in its first full year under Smucker ownership. Nobody involved could have predicted what it would eventually become. The real signal came in 2002. Procter & Gamble, the Cincinnati consumer goods giant, had been quietly reassessing its product portfolio for years, choosing to exit categories where it saw limited growth and concentrate on higher-margin businesses. With 2 of the brands it released were Jif Peanut Butter and Crisco Cooking Oil. Smuckers acquired both in a $781.5 million stock transaction, a reverse Morris Trust structure that was itself largely unprecedented in American corporate history at that scale. Just like that, Smuckers owned the #1 peanut butter brand and the #1 cooking shortening brand in the United States, along with jams and jellies, and it could now offer retailers a complete breakfast and baking portfolio. It was audacious, it was calculated, and it was only the beginning. 2008, Orrville, Ohio, and Cincinnati, Ohio. By 2008, Starbucks had been open for 37 years. Single-serve coffee machines were transforming the way Americans brewed at home. The premium coffee market was fracturing in ways that nobody could have predicted 20 years earlier. And Procter & Gamble, it then once again reassessing its portfolio, decided that Folgers Coffee, America's best-selling retail ground coffee brand, a 150-year-old California institution with $1.6 billion in annual sales, no longer fit its strategic vision. On November 6, 2008, J.M. Smucker Company completed the purchase of Folgers from Procter & Gamble in an all-stock reverse Morris Trust transaction valued at approximately $3.3 billion, including the assumption of $350 million in Folgers debt. The deal was structured so that Procter & Gamble shareholders received approximately 53.5% of Smucker shares after the merger, effectively handing majority ownership of the combined company to former P&G investors. The transaction, when settled, nearly doubled the size of J.M. Smucker overnight. Timothy Smucker called Folgers a perfect strategic fit within our portfolio of leading and iconic North American food brands. The analysts approved. The numbers validated the logic. Smucker's now owned the #1 brands in jams and jellies, peanut butter, cooking oil, and ground coffee. 4 category leaders. 4 positions that could anchor a breakfast-to-baking pitch to every major grocery retailer in the country. But here's the thing. If the Folgers acquisition came at precisely the moment when canned ground coffee was beginning its slow structural decline. The brand itself remained powerful. But the category, the old-fashioned supermarket shelf coffee, was losing ground to premium roasters, specialty pods, and a generation of consumers who measured their coffee in terms of single-origin beans and brew temperature rather than can size and price per ounce. Smucker's had acquired a fortress brand in a weakening market. Now, they would work hard to stabilize it, picking up Roland Coffee Roasters and its Latin brands in 2010 and the North American coffee and tea operations of Sara Lee in 2011. But the fundamental challenge remained. Meanwhile, they were also watching something unexpected happen in their own freezer section. Uncrustables, that $12 million novelty product they had picked up in 1998, was beginning to grow in ways that defied explanation. In 2010, Orrville, Ohio. There was no announcement, no press release, no headline declaring that Smucker's jam had slipped into irrelevance. It happened the way most corporate declines happen. Gradually, in the background, while attention was focused elsewhere. The jam still sold, the Smucker's name still graced the shelves. The strawberry logo still smiled from its label, but the revenue it generated had become, in the words of industry observers, almost insignificant relative to the company's total financial picture. By the end of the fiscal year, closing April 2019, J.M. Smucker Company recorded total net sales of nearly $8 billion. Pet food alone generated $2.9 billion of that. Coffee, led by Folgers, contributed $2.1 billion. The famous jams and jellies, the product Jerome Monroe Smucker had signed with his own hand on every stone crock he sold from his horse-drawn wagon, it were a fraction of what coffee brought in, a fraction of what pet food brought in. The structural shift had been quiet, but complete. Smucker's flagship product had become the company's background brand. Not dead, not gone, but no longer the center of the story. Part of the explanation lay with competition. The jam and jelly market had fragmented. Private label products, which Smucker's had always refused to produce, had captured substantial shelf space. Craft and artisanal jam makers, operating at a premium price point, were attracting health-conscious and food-curious consumers who wanted smaller batch, local-source products that a mass manufacturer simply could not authentically replicate. The category itself had split in 2 directions, toward cheap private label at one end and toward premium artisan at the other, leaving branded national players like Smucker's squeezed in the middle. The company responded by continuing its acquisition strategy with extraordinary aggression. In 2015, J.M. Smucker acquired Big Heart Pet Brands, the parent company of Milk-Bone dog treats, Meow Mix cat food, Kibbles and Bits, and Pup Peroni, for $5.8 billion. The transaction brought the company into a category it had never touched before, animal nutrition, and it worked. Pet food revenues climbed steadily. But with every new acquisition, the company moved further from the Ohio farmhouse where a man named Jerome had cooked apple butter in wooden vats and signed his name on every lid. The question was, how far could they go before they lost something essential? We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything and helps us keep making these deep dives into the companies that shaped America. What comes next is where things get genuinely complicated and expensive. 2020, Scottsville, Kentucky. Inside the Smucker's Uncrustables production facility in Scottsville, Kentucky, the machines ran 24 hours a day. Each one produced the same product: a circular sealed sandwich, crustless, filled with peanut butter and jelly, stamped at the seam with a ridged edge that pressed the bread shut in a perfect ring. 4 million of them were produced every single day. 4 million in a single facility. And it still was not enough. The COVID-19 pandemic had done something extraordinary for Smucker's consumer foods business. With schools closed and parents suddenly packing lunches at home at unprecedented scale, Uncrustables became a pantry staple overnight. Sales of the Smucker's brand overall rose 25% in the quarter ending August 2020. Uncrustables alone surged 35% decrease. Still in the portfolio, jumped 50% as home baking exploded in popularity. The company had, accidentally or not, positioned itself perfectly for a quarantine economy. It owned the brands people reached for when they were spending all their time at home. But the Uncrustables story was not a pandemic accident. It had been building quietly for over 2 decades. From its $12 million beginning in 1998, the brand had grown to $500 million in annual sales by 2021, registering double-digit growth every single year for the past decade. In November 2021, CEO Mark Smucker, the 5th generation of his family to lead the company, having taken the top role in 2016, announced a $1.1 billion investment in a brand new 900,000 square foot manufacturing facility in McCalla, Alabama, to meet demand. 900,000 square feet. To make crustless sandwiches. The McCalla facility opened in November 2024. By that point, the brand had grown further to approximately $800 million in annual net sales. The goal, declared by Mark Smucker publicly and repeatedly, was to reach $1 billion in annual Uncrustables revenue by the close of fiscal year 2026. 3 facilities dedicated to a single sandwich product: Scottsville, Kentucky, Longmont, Colorado, McCalla, Alabama. Combined investment exceeding $1.1 billion, all for a product that, in 1998, had seemed like a clever lunch convenience item with limited commercial potential. The apple butter salesman from Orrville could never have imagined it, and yet, somehow it fit. Yet say it fit. 2004, Orrville, Ohio. The company had been family-run for 4 full generations. And that alone was an achievement that statistics struggled to convey. Only 4% of family-run businesses survive into the 4th generation. Smucker's had not merely survived. It had grown from a horse-drawn wagon to a Fortune 500 company. Without ever surrendering control of the name on the front door to outside investors or professional managers who had no blood connection to Orrville. In 2004, Fortune magazine named J.M. is Smucker Company the #1 best company to work for in the United States. The award reflected something real. Workers in Orrville described the relationship between the company and the community as something closer to an ecosystem than a standard employer-employee dynamic. Smucker's funded schools, supported community organizations, and kept the town economically viable for over a century. Nearly 90% of American households had at least one Smucker's product in their home. Tim Smucker, who served as co-CEO alongside brother Richard from the late 1980s until 2016, had a philosophy inherited directly from his grandfather Paul and great-grandfather Jerome. The 5 core values of the company were quality, people, ethics, growth, and independence. Not profit first, not shareholder return first. Independence, meaning the family's ability to maintain control and direction, was explicitly included as a foundational principle. When Mark Smucker became CEO in 2016, he was the great-great-grandson of Jerome Monroe, the 5th consecutive generation. He had grown up in Orrville. He had worked inside the company. and he arrived at the top at precisely the moment when the company's strategic choices were becoming more complex and more consequential than they had ever been before. The jam was fading as a revenue driver. The coffee market was shifting. Pet food was strong but competitive. What's saying? And a company that had always been defined by its founding product was now being defined almost entirely by what it had bought, rather than what it had originally made. Meanwhile, something else was approaching. Something that would test the fifth generation's judgment in ways that no previous generation of Smuckers had faced. An acquisition so bold, so expensive, and ultimately so problematic that it would send the company into the most difficult financial chapter of its 128-year history, September 11th, 2023. Orrville, Ohio, and Lenexa, Kansas. On September 11th, 2023, J.M. Smucker Company announced it had signed a definitive agreement to acquire Hostess Brands, Inc., the maker of Twinkies, donuts, ding-dongs, ho-hos, yum, and cupcakes, for $34.25 per share in a cash and stock transaction representing a total enterprise value of approximately $5.6 billion, including roughly $900 million of net Hostess debt. The premium paid over Hostess's pre-announcement stock price was 54%. 54% above market value for a company making snack cakes that had been declining in relevance for years. The strategic logic, as Mark Smucker presented it, was coherent on the surface. Hostess would give Smuckers a dominant position in the sweet-baked snacks aisle. The brands were iconic. The convenience store distribution network was strong. The acquisition would expand Smucker's total addressable market significantly. And with $100 million in projected synergies and a skilled commercial organization already in place, the deal was presented as a calculated expansion into a growing snacking category. Analysts nodded. Investors cheered. The transaction closed in November 2023. What happened next was not what the boardroom models had projected. The sweet-baked snacks segment, home to Twinkies and the full Hostess line, began underperforming almost immediately. The problem was not execution exactly. It was something more fundamental. The consumer who bought Twinkies was disappearing. A generation increasingly focused on protein intake, low-sugar diets, and the weight management medications known as GLP-1 drugs was quietly but decisively walking past the snack cake aisle. Nostalgia, it turned out, was not a moat. Recognition was not the same as purchase intent. America still remembered Twinkies fondly. But a growing number of Americans had stopped buying them. By the third quarter of fiscal year 2025, the sweet-baked snacks segment posted an 8% decline in net sales. And then Smucker dropped a $794 million goodwill impairment charge, an accounting acknowledgement that the assets it had acquired were worth substantially less than the price it had paid. The company that had been built on hand-signed crocks of apple butter was now bleeding $794 million in a single quarter from snack cakes, and it was about to get worse. 2025. Orrville, Ohio. Yes, the fourth quarter of fiscal year 2025 arrived like a verdict. Sales in the sweet-baked snacks segment fell 14%, following the prior quarter's 8% drop. A second goodwill impairment charge of $867 million hit the books. Another $113 million was written off the value of the Hostess brand trademark itself. Combined with the earlier charges, approximately $1.66 billion in goodwill impairment had been recorded against the Hostess acquisition, but roughly 38% of the total $5.5 billion purchase price vaporized in accounting charges within less than 18 months of closing. The company reported a net loss of $729 million for the quarter. The stock dropped more than 15% in a single trading session on June 10th. in 2025, erasing nearly $1.8 billion in shareholder value in a single day. Two prominent law firms, Kirby McInerney, LLP, and Hagens Berman, opened investigations into whether Smucker's had misled investors about the potential of the Hostess acquisition, and whether management had delayed disclosing the deterioration of the sweet-baked snacks business in a timely manner. The investigations were formal and public. And management credibility was now directly on the line. CEO Mark Smucker acknowledged on an earnings call that the company had underestimated the complexity of integrating Hostess's distribution network. He acknowledged that growth expectations for the brand had dimmed considerably. The company revised its entire fiscal 2026 financial outlook downward due to what it described as the sustained underperformance of the sweet baked goods business. Total company debt. Chummies, following the Hostess acquisition, stood at approximately $7.8 billion. An enormous burden for a company generating around $8.7 billion in annual revenue. The deleveraging process would require years of disciplined cash flow management and further asset divestitures. In September 2024, Smucker's had already sold Voortman cookies, acquired as part of the Hostess deal, to Second Nature Brands for $305 million. What the Knott's Berry Farm grocery brand was discontinued entirely in January 2024 due to low sales. The jam empire had spent 128 years building itself outward from a single family's kitchen recipe. Now it was selling pieces of itself to pay for a bet on Twinkies that had not paid off. Return to Orrville, Ohio. The house that Jerome Monroe Smucker built in 1907 still stands on the corporate campus at 1 Strawberry Lane. It restored in 1983, it sits less than 500 feet from the modern headquarters building. The original railroad siding, the private rail connection Willard arranged with the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1928, is preserved nearby in what the company now calls the Innovation Center. The physical artifacts of the empire's beginning remain carefully maintained. A museum inside the campus retail store traces the company's evolution across more than a century. If the jam is easy to miss, it's there. The jam is easy to miss, it's there. The gingham label, the strawberry logo, the glass jar that Willard introduced in 1939. But it shares shelf space now with cat food brands and packaged Twinkies and coffee pods. The founding product is present, just no longer the point. From this story, three lessons emerge, not as simple morals, but as hard-won truths embedded in 128 years of American commercial history. The first lesson is the danger of category confusion. Smucker's genius was always its clarity, a family name, a fruit product, a promise of quality. For decades, that clarity was the company's greatest competitive weapon. Every acquisition that moved the company further from that clarity into pickles, into Australian food companies, into English preserves subsidiaries, and ultimately into Twinkies, risked severing the invisible thread that connected the brand's power to its origin. Strength that cannot be explained often cannot be replicated. The second lesson is that nostalgia is not a business plan. Hostess Brands was deeply familiar to tens of millions of Americans. Recognition and purchase are not the same thing. A brand can be remembered warmly and still decline commercially. The consumer who smiles at a Twinkie is not necessarily the consumer who buys one. $5.5 billion was paid for a smile. The third lesson is about the permanence of private label pressure. Smucker's chairman once called private label jams heresy. The market did not agree. The patient, consistent improvement of store brand products, cheaper, comparably good, and sitting right next to the name brand jar, slowly eroded the premium that the Smucker's name commanded. No slogan, so, however brilliant, permanently insulates a product from price competition. The numbers assembled. Founded 1897, $1 million in sales by 1939, 25% U.S. market share in jams and jellies by 1980, $8.7 billion in total revenue by 2025. Net loss of $1.2 billion in fiscal 2025. Jam and jelly revenue, a fraction of the whole. And 128 years, one family, 5 generations. And the question that now sits at the center of everything, when everything else has changed, and the product that built your name barely shows up in your earnings report, what exactly are you? The Smucker's jar is still there, on the shelf, in almost 90% of American homes. Quiet, familiar, a little diminished, and still improbably good.